All right, I'm here with Max Lugavere. We're gonna give you the playbook on how to guarantee you feel like garbage. So it sounds kind of cheeky, and it kind of is, but Max, what is the number one thing that people can do to ensure that they feel like total dog crap?
Like total dog crap? Well, I think, due to the milieu of the standard American diet today, we have this situation where 73% of the US food supply is ultra processed. So actually there was a new study that came out using machine learning technology, looked at all of the available foods in your average supermarket, 73% ultra processed, which by definition are foods that you couldn't make in your own kitchen. So that's the reason why I think the data seems to point to an overconsumption for your average person of these foods, shelf-stable, packaged, ultra-processed foods. And so today your average person is consuming 60% of their calories from these kinds of foods, which contribute to the fact that most of us are walking around overfed and undernourished. So you're just not gonna feel good when you're eating foods that are explicitly designed to drive their own overconsumption. Usually they're nutrient depleted, they're depleted of protein, for one, because it's cheap. Like to make a food product based around carbs and fat, it's like the most high margin that a food product can be. And protein, we know, is the most satiating macronutrient. I mean, you've talked about this many times, but if you want to spend your day walking around hungry, you're going to eat ultra-processed foods that are depleted of protein because they tend to drive their own overconsumption. They have that characteristic known as hyperpalatability. And yeah, they're one of the foundational aspects of the standard American diet, which is the driver behind all sorts of modern chronic non-communicable conditions, whether we're talking about overweight or obesity, which by the way, by the year 2030, 1 in 2 people are going to be not just overweight, but obese, type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, hypertension, and ultimately down the line, dementia. We saw recent research showing that for every 10% increment in ultra-processed foods that people consume, their risk of developing dementia goes up by 25%. So definitely what you want to do to feel like crap throughout the day is to base your diet, as so many are, around these types of foods, ultra-processed, foods that have seemingly endless ingredient lists, endless shelf lives. And instead, base your diet around, if you want the antidote to that, it's the perishable foods. It's the foods that you find around the perimeter of the supermarket, the meat, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds, fruits, vegetables, things like that. The kinds of foods where you can clearly identify the ingredients involved. I think that's a pretty good, there's this idea that people will say, naturalistic fallacy, but I think actually the number of ingredients that a food product has probably correlates pretty tightly to the degree of processing that food has undergone, right? And while most nutrient profiling systems, I think, are pretty subpar, the NOVA system, which was devised in South America, is actually where we get the term ultra-processed from.
The downside with macadamia nuts, they're expensive, but House of Macadamia has the best prices that you're gonna find. Plus, that link down below will save you 20% off your entire order. And you get a free box of Namibian sea salt macadamia nuts. Not just a bag, an entire box of them. So a huge value, plus 20% off whatever you want from their site. Now, additionally, they have these sugar-free chocolate-covered macadamia nuts. So they have white chocolate and regular chocolate, and there's no sugar in them. We're talking totally keto-friendly, so you can have macadamia nuts that are dipped in chocolate without the guilt. So that link down below saves you 20% off your entire order, plus a free box of macadamia nuts. And you know that you're doing good because you're helping benefit the farmers in South Africa. So a tremendous deal only for the people that watch my videos. Down below, just below this video.
And so basically, how to identify an ultra-processed food? Well, it's a food that contains ingredients that you can't pronounce, that you likely would not have in your own kitchen. You couldn't recreate the food in your own kitchen if you tried. And it doesn't rot, it doesn't roam, it doesn't perish, things like that.
That sounds like a fun video idea. You and I should try to recreate processed foods in our kitchen and see what happens.
Yeah.
That would just be an interesting thing. So can we actually do it? Okay, can we go find polysorbate 80? Can we go get titanium dioxide? Let's see what happens. It's going to it'll look like a I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult. And that is the definition of an ultra processed food, essentially. It's a food that can only be made inside of a lab or a food factory. And that's one of the reasons why they're so foreign to our biology, right? Because they're not the kinds of foods that we evolved on. They're foods that prior to 50, 100 years ago, we didn't have the machinery, we didn't have the chemistry sets to create. And one really controversial food is, or food-like product, I should say, is, our ultra-processed, refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils. Now, I think for many people, the jury is still out on whether or not this ingredient is good for us, right? Some argue that it's fine to consume in moderation. Some argue that it's like, the smoking gun in modern chronic disease. But the reality is, wherever you stand on the issue, they're ultra processed, and they're a good indicator they're a good proxy for ultra processed foods, because, prior to 100 years ago, we didn't have these oils in the food supply.
Well, we certainly didn't have hexane and deodorizers, and that's a big issue with that, and that in and of itself, and the sometimes heat in which they have to treat, and the conditions in which they have to actually treat these oils to make them shelf stable. If you were to magically squeeze the juice out of an almond or in the oil, you're talking a completely different situation. Or take up even a pine nut, which is arguably very high omega-6, and in some categories considered bad because of high omega-6. But if you were to just straight up squeeze that oil fresh and then drizzle it, I don't think it would be one iota or a fraction of a percent of the problem as we deal with these heavily modified bleached oils. Like, that's the problem, right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, people talk about seed oils like without appropriate nuance and context, and like sesame seed oil is a perfectly healthy oil that Japanese culture, and other types of Asian cuisine, they've been using for millennia, because to create it, all you do is you squeeze the sesame seed, and in so doing, it retains all of the vitamin E, other antioxidants, lignans, and all other kinds of plant compounds that Mother Nature has packaged with those delicate fats to protect them. But then, about 100 years ago, we started pressing these, these byproduct oils. We started deriving oils from these byproducts, like, for example, with grapeseed oil. Grapeseed oil is a byproduct of winemaking, essentially. And you can't use it straight, from the grapeseed. You have to run it through all these different processes. They're actually referred to as RBD oils, because the steps are refining, bleaching, and deodorizing. And that novel step, the deodorization step, actually creates trans fats in the process. So yeah, there are all these potential consequences to the ultra processing of food. And that's not to say that, we have to be clear, not all processing is bad, right? Like, when you have a whole apple and you slice it, you're processing it to some degree, right? If you blend it into a puree, you're processing it even further. You take that puree and you put it through a cheesecloth and you derive the juice, you're processing it further. You use that juice and you create a fruit snack. That's an ultra-processed product, right? So, processing is a continuum, but I think at the end of the day, the more we can become aware and capable of identifying what an ultra-processed food is, I think that's that is probably the low-hanging fruit for most people. Again, in a time where 60% of the calories that your average person consumes are coming from these kinds of foods, I think that's a major win. If you could just change nothing else, but be able to identify and minimize your consumption of those foods.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, so that's a big one. All right,
yeah.
Number 2, what would you say?
Well, I think, we live in a time where more and more people are just sedentary, chronically sedentary. Leisure time physical activity is at an all-time low. And the CDC there was a study that just came out that I think they found that 1 in 4 adults is completely sedentary. And this makes sense when you look at statistics regarding, the prevalence of metabolic disease. Today, about 9 in 10 adults have some component of metabolic syndrome. As I mentioned, 1 in 2 adults are trending towards full-blown obesity. And so, the sedentary behavior, I think, is a massive problem. And if you really want to feel like crap, you'll sit on your butt all day long, in front of a computer screen. When you're sitting, blood literally drains from your brain. We see this. Brain perfusion diminishes with extended seated time, and it actually reperfuses with just a couple minutes of walking. So one tip that I like to give people: for every half an hour of seated time, go on a 2-minute walk. If you work in an office, just take a stroll around the office, or maybe go up and down a few flights of stairs. But non-exercise physical activity, I think, is crucial. Especially for people in the fitness world. It's sometimes getting to the top of the mountain, if you're in a state of being really overweight, it can seem like this daunting task. That's where I think, reminding people of the value that just movement has, for your average person. I know that when I'm sedentary, say, if I'm stuck on an airplane all day for 8 hours, I feel like a different person. I start to get like a headache. I just don't, I don't look as good. Like I feel like, the blood, like the color leaves my face. So I think, imbuing your day with more movement is crucially important. I mean, we see that just simple walking decreases blood sugar. Just going for a walk, you can decrease postprandial blood sugar. Going for a walk activates lipoprotein lipase, so it literally sucks fat out of your blood, right? Like we know that chronically elevated triglycerides, risk factor for heart disease, chronically elevated blood sugar, risk factor for pretty much everything. And going for a walk is like the ultimate salve, it's like the ultimate antidote to, I think, so many of the problems that we're seeing today.
There was an interesting study last year, I can't remember which journal it was published in, but it was looking at basically even sitting down, I hope that people don't get their wind taken out of their sails with this, but can counteract the negative or the positive effects of a morning workout. So if you were to work out in the morning and then go be sedentary, my point in saying that is not to, hey, skip your workout, it's worthless. My point in saying that is that you are quite literally from just a metabolic risk standpoint, better off skipping the workout and just moving intermittently throughout the day than you are going to the gym for 45 minutes and then being sedentary the rest of the day. It's that chronic extended period of time that you're sedentary that seems to be a serious factor. And unfortunately, we live in a world where artificial exercise, I call it artificial because it kind of is the only access we feasibly have. We live these busy lives where we're sitting down and we feel like if we don't carve time out of our day to just go to the gym, then we're going to be sedentary 100% of the time. And although I understand and I agree that going to the gym is better than not going to the gym, if it really comes down to like your time and your energy, I would almost suggest just go for a few 10 or 15 minute walks throughout the course of the day so you're not sitting down for 9 hours straight is almost a better recipe than saying 45 minutes in the gym and then 10 hours of being sedentary.
Absolutely, yeah. Walking, I mean, it's good for your endothelium. Like it creates shear stress, because it creates this demand on your vasculature that you're not getting when you're just sitting in front of your television screen. It's like the ultimate fat burning exercise because it's low intensity. It's purely aerobic. It doesn't increase your hunger the way that higher intensity forms of exercise does. So like if you're on a fat loss regimen, like it's a great low impact way to move. It moves like lymph fluid around your body. I mean, there are fluids in your body that don't have their own heart and literally rely on us moving to get swooshed around the body. So yeah, I mean, as far as like bang for your buck goes, I mean, walking is just incredible.
Okay, so hyperpalatable ultra-processed foods plus sitting down now are already a good recipe for feeling like garbage. What would you say number 3 is?
So yeah, I think being chronically indoors, being chronically disconnected from nature is another big one. I mean, for one, there are the well-documented benefits that you get from exposure to, say, greenery, with regard to reducing stress and reducing chronically elevated cortisol levels. There's the ambient exposure to the sun that helps to anchor your body's and brain's circadian rhythm through the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is really important for ensuring that you're going to be alert and focused and able to perform at your peak during the day, which is when a Homo sapien would typically like need to be at his best, right? To forage, to find new camping grounds and the like for one of our ancestors. So, the sun, we interface with the sun in a really symbiotic, synergistic way. But then also spending more time indoors. The EPA now estimates that we spend about 93% of our time indoors. And we can't forget that when the more time we spend indoors, the more time we're spending around synthetic goods that we know have the potential to off-gas and expose us to compounds like VOCs, volatile organic compounds, or the dust that's emitted by our electronics that contain plastic particles. There's actually a phenomenon called sick building syndrome. So people that inhabit these like poorly ventilated office buildings, which, by the way, office buildings are becoming less and less well ventilated because it saves money, right? To be more insulated is actually, from a cost standpoint, actually more beneficial to the building owner. This phenomena, sick building syndrome, actually, like people develop these like sickness symptoms that have no root cause other than the exposure to these kinds of compounds in the building, like the lack of fresh air, right? Like too high a concentration of carbon dioxide. But then there's all these other compounds that off-gas, And so, yeah, spending more time outdoors would be the antidote to being chronically indoors, chronically disconnected from nature.
Okay, and that obviously goes hand in hand with being sedentary, because most people aren't sitting on a recliner out in the sun.
There you go.
Sitting in a recliner watching TV. So, all right, so 1, 2, and 3, what do we got for number 4?
Oh man, number 4, where to take it? Well, I mean, I think it's hard to discount the role that sleep plays in feeling optimally. We live in stressful times. People tend to romanticize being chronically busy. There's that mantra, I'll sleep when I'm dead, which I don't think does anybody's health any favors. I mean, we know that when we sleep, our brains are highly active, helping to fortify the emotional centers in our brain, helping to cleanse our brains of proteins that build up over the course of the day, like amyloid beta, which is associated with Alzheimer's disease. It's like a waste protein that we know actually gets flushed from our brains as we sleep, thanks to the newly discovered glymphatic system. So when you sleep, it's like pressing reset on almost every aspect of your biology. On just one night of poor sleep, we see that levels of amyloid beta increase by about 30%. In cerebrospinal fluid, levels of tau, which is another problematic protein that gets misfolded in various neuropathological conditions, increase by about 50%. Again, in cerebrospinal fluid. We see that you're essentially pre-diabetic temporarily the next day after a night of poor sleep. You're inclined to overconsume calories by about 400, meta-analyses show, the following day after a night of poor sleep. So yeah, I mean, getting good sleep, I think, is like really, really important. And it's like you feel reborn on a night of like good sleep. I think we tend to underappreciate it, but I mean, there are really simple things that you can do to optimize the way that you sleep. And I think good sleep begins the morning of. So, I mean, there's so many aspects of what we've, already talked about can be solved by sleeping well and spending more time in nature. So for me, like one of the foundational aspects of my morning routine is literally just getting outside and like going on a quick walk after waking up, because good sleep begins the morning of. And just walking briefly after waking up, you're allowing that morning sun to enter your eyes, you're anchoring your body's circadian rhythm, you're ensuring that at the appropriate time in the evening, your pineal gland is going to start to secrete melatonin, which isn't just a sleep hormone. I mean, it's crucially important for getting good sleep. It's also like a fountain of youth produced by our own brains. It's a super powerful antioxidant. It's involved in chemoprotection. So yeah, optimizing sleep, like prioritizing your sleep, making it actually a priority and not just an afterthought, I think is another one of these like low-hanging fruit that we should all be paying more attention to.
You mentioned the glymphatic system. Kind of a cool hot tip with that is a lot of that is driven by what's called intracranial pressure, and being able to, and this is just a tip that I've learned over the last couple of years, is, we talk about benefits of saunas and things like that. Utilizing a high heat dry sauna, it unfortunately doesn't get hot enough with infrared to really do as much of the job, but with a high heat sauna, you're increasing that intracranial pressure and increasing the amount of blood that's going into the brain. So then when you do go into that glymphatic clearance at night, there's more intracranial pressure sort of left over, and you can flush waste metabolites a lot better. So it's kind of a hot tip, like if people have access to a sauna, it's a little bit biohacky. Not everybody has that access. And don't get me wrong, infrared is better than none. But doing that at night within a couple hours of bed, people notice they wake up significantly more refreshed. And if you start looking at like, okay, sleep should be your priority, but also prioritizing sleep efficiency, not just sleep duration. So you might be one of these people that maybe you only sleep 6 hours. Like maybe you wake up bright-eyed, bushy-tailed at 6 hours. Well, that's fine. Some people are wired that way, but do everything that you can to make sure you're getting through the proper cycles during that 6 hour period. And sauna is just a powerful one. Also utilizing red light therapy if you can't get outside for whatever reason, and timing it appropriately.
Yeah, the architecture of sleep is really interesting. It's like sleep seems to be front loaded with the processes that help to support and ensure our immediate survival. So if you actually look at like the hormonal milieu that occurs earlier, like the shifts in hormones that occur earlier in the night, they're all to like rejuvenate the body. Like we get that spike in growth hormone, we get that spike in testosterone, they help with like recovery. And that all tends to, that like sleep is front loaded with that stuff. But then later in the night, and this is why you don't want to shortchange your sleep duration, is where like the processes that fortify mental health come into play. So these are the more like higher order processes that are really important to feeling good throughout the day, but aren't necessarily as essential to survival. So that's where you really want to focus on, both sleep quality, super, super important, but also sleep duration. So those are the two, I think, primary variables. It's not just about sleeping longer, and it's not just about like necessarily feeling great on 4 hours of sleep. Like you want to make sure that you're sleeping you want to make sure that you've got both variables under control.
Yeah, absolutely with that. I've never thought of it like that. That's super interesting because, all your growth hormone pulses, that's all happening in the first 4 hours. And I never thought of it as sort of a survival mechanism, where it's like, okay, you can get through another day if we at least repair your body, but you might not be able to get a whole lot further than that if we don't repair your mind. But we'll kind of let that mind slide for a little bit so you can at least get up and have your body function, so you can at least go and get your kill and survive.
Absolutely,
that makes so much sense. That's really wild.
Yeah, and the glymphatic system, that's most active during slow wave sleep, which again is like front loaded towards like the earlier part of the night. But later on in the night, you get more REM sleep, REM sleep, which is like associated with better mental health, right? Like REM sleep is, we think, one of the primary roles is to fortify the emotional centers of the brain, which is not necessarily, key to survival, but important to feeling your best, right?
Totally.
So if you want to feel like absolute curtail your sleep duration.
Okay, so we've got this nice little cocktail here of really everything that'll make you feel terrible. What's the icing on the cake here?
Would be dehydration. I think the fifth variable that you really want to be mindful of is making sure that you're hydrating well. And so that there are, myriad variables there too. It's not necessarily just as simple as drinking more water or more fluids. It's making sure that, you're consuming adequate electrolytes. People vary in their needs for electrolytes. Like people who sweat vigorously, like athletes who are watching this, people who regularly sauna, people on low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets, people who fast, are gonna have a higher need for electrolytes. And the primary, there's calcium, there's magnesium, there's potassium, there's sodium, there's chloride, but primarily when you sweat, the mineral that you're losing the most of is sodium, along with chloride. And so, making sure that you're replenishing your electrolytes is super important. And dehydration, just 2%, dehydration by 2% actually can impair your cognitive function. So,
I've talked about that study specifically on my channel. Yeah.
Have you? Yeah. It's real, and that's like it's fairly easy to like wake, because sleep, for example, is a dehydrative event. So a lot of people wake up and they're in a state of dehydration. So for me, like when I wake up, one of the things that I reach for is, I'll sprinkle a little bit of like sea salt in my water, or I have like trace minerals. Sometimes I'll put that in there, which has other minerals in it as well. But yeah, especially for people who are on like predominantly whole foods diets, which people should be on predominantly whole foods diets. Most people get adequate sodium because most people are over consuming ultra processed foods. Only 11% of the sodium that your average person ingests comes from their salt shaker, right? So the minute you start cutting out of your diet like the packaged, processed, shelf-stable foods, where manufacturers will add copious sodium to as a flavor enhancer, you actually do start to become cognizant. You need to start to become cognizant of like where your sodium is coming from. And I find that when I'm, especially like during phases where I become a little bit more like calorie conscious, or I'm eating on a predominantly lower carbohydrate diet, I start to feel like really depleted unless I'm like literally focusing on like where I'm getting my electrolytes from.
Yeah, it's easy for people to think that, okay, well, I'm getting enough sodium, so now I don't need to worry about my hydration. There's a serious caveat there, because once your sodium levels, your intake is higher, but let's say you're not inactive, or you're not active, excuse me, I'm going to rephrase that so it sounds right. What people don't understand is that if your sodium levels are where they should be, whether it's from processed foods or possibly more than what they should be, and you're inactive, it becomes easier to get dehydrated. So in an athletic sense, or in just a recreationally active person, if you're perspiring and you add sodium in, that sodium is helping you replete, and it's helping you actually draw water in the proper stage. But if you are not constantly having this movement back and forth where you're having this ion exchange sort of thing, then the sodium is actually just making you more dehydrated. So it's easy to think, oh, I'm getting a lot of salt, so I'm properly hydrated. Well, on the contrary, it's actually making you more dehydrated. And I think there's this common misnomer that's out there that you have electrolytes and it's going to magically make you hydrated, but you're missing the key element, which is just purely water. And as you mentioned, you start your day dehydrated. I've learned to front load my hydration early in the day for a couple of reasons. One, left to my own devices, I will get to 3 p.m. and I'll be like, crap, I didn't drink enough water. And we've all been there where it's like, okay, so you start pounding it. And then next thing you know, it's bedtime and you're waking up 2 or 3 times to pee. And then you're disrupting your sleep and unravels, right? So my recommendation is, just like you stated, like I front load my water intake as much as I can, almost to the point of saturation. I just load it because I know if I don't get it in before like 1 or 2 p.m., it gets incrementally more difficult to hydrate as the day goes on.
I never thought about doing that, but that's actually a great idea because I tend to wake up to pee, every night. And sometimes before bed I get really thirsty. But yeah, I mean, the value of hydration can't be underappreciated. I mean, it's super, super important. And we do things on a regular basis. Also, depending on where you live, right? That's another variable. Like there are lots of variables that lend this to not being a one-size-fits-all like recommendation. But by and large, people that are active, that are exercising, that are on diets that are different than the standard American diet, I mean, do need to think about where they're getting their electrolytes from.
There was another study that mentioned that it was like 40% increase in the duration of delayed onset muscle soreness with just a minute amount of dehydration. I can't remember how much dehydration it was. And that got incrementally worse with age. So after age 40, after age 50, that same level of dehydration would have a more prolonged effect on their delayed onset muscle soreness. So if you're thinking, okay, well, I don't want to push it hard in the gym because I always get sore. Like, yeah, that's a very viable thing. That's a very real thing. And a lot of us face that. But sheer hydration might be a way to combat that. So we tend to forget there isn't a way to more quickly feel like garbage than to like dehydrate yourself immediately. Not to mention, if you're depleted in sodium, if you are one of those individuals, you have to remember how sodium acts as far as actual signal transduction, sending a signal from the brain to our muscles to actually be able to move our body. So if you're deficient in sodium, or you've been sweating a lot and you're losing all your minerals, okay, what the heck's gonna happen? You're gonna lose that energy, you're gonna lose that action potential, you're gonna lose the ability to actually wanna contract your muscles. And that doesn't just happen in the muscular level, that's happening in between signals in our brain too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like most people would be shocked to know that the number one source of dietary sodium in the American diet for the previous decade or so has been bread and rolls, which is like really counterintuitive. I think most people would expect it to be like processed meats or canned foods, but it was bread and rolls up until this past year, where the number one source of sodium in the American diet actually is now pizza. So yeah, the number one source of dietary sodium. So I mean, if you're conscious, for example, of like where your carbs come from and you're not a regular pizza consumer, yeah, I mean, that's where this all becomes, like, salt is very valuable. Like, the word salary is thought to derive from salt. Like, for the vast majority of our evolution, this was like a mineral that was like fairly difficult to come by unless you were like living on the coasts.
If you put a salt lick, talk about this all the time, put a salt lick in the middle of a field, animals will find it. Because it's that critical for their survival. And to wrap up the sodium discussion, there's one thing that a very wise person once told me. He's like, the problem is not salt, it's unopposed salt or unopposed sodium. And when you have sodium in isolation without other minerals, and that's when it becomes problematic. And when it's balanced with other minerals, magnesium, potassium, chloride, you name it, that's when you have this homeostasis and proper mineralization.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're balancing it out with potassium. I think that's a fantastic strategy. But I mean, just as an N of one anecdote, I consume electrolytes on a regular basis. I mean, I consume sometimes, just from like electrolytes alone, I'll consume 2,000 milligrams of sodium. And I'm not saying that they should be representative of everybody because everybody's different. But my blood pressure, comes out like perfect. And it's and this is something that I'm actually very aware of because blood pressure is one of the most important modifiable, high blood pressure is one of the most important modifiable risk factors for the development of cognitive decline and dementia. So you really want to avoid hypertension, but it's only about 15% of the population that are sodium sensitive hypertensives. And again, even for that person, even for a sodium sensitive hypertensive, it's the minority of sodium that's coming from like what you're adding to your recipes at home and what you're adding to your foods with your salt shaker. So I'm not a big advocate of salt abstention. I think, instead it should be dosed in accordance with your own needs and ultimately eliminated as best as one can from ultra-processed foods.
Well, Max, where can everyone find you, man?
Thank you, dude. Well, I have my own podcast. It's called The Genius Life, where I've had you. We had a fantastic conversation, so people can go and check that out on all podcast platforms. And then I'm very active on Instagram, and I have my own YouTube channel called, it's The Genius Life on YouTube. So check that out.
Well, we'll link out to all those down below. And Max, thanks, my man.
Joe, thank you, brother.
Thanks.